Well, hello there, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us on our very first podcast. When I say us, I mean me, which is Nigel from INTA ACT, and my good friend and partner for these purposes,
Robin from Wellbeing. Hi.
When we put this idea together in relation to what we want to do, the idea was that we wanted to do something a little bit of a different type of podcast, right? And the logic behind that was that myself and Robin have had lots of discussions in relation to the way that we do things. And we do, it's almost like, like the old song that you take the high road, I'll take the low road, and I'll get to Scotland before you, right? We're looking for the same destination, but we're actually coming from slightly different directions. Our aspirations are the same, but our approaches are slightly different. So what these podcasts are going to be, they're going to be a situation where either one of us or both of us will put forward an idea in relation to how we think we can help other people, how we think that we can make a contribution to working with people and improving their well-being. Then, hopefully, you will join in that conversation, and then we'll have a conversation amongst ourselves to sort of, shall we say, politely inquire about some of the ways in which we do things differently. But we are trying to aim for that same objective. Let me take these off a moment to reflect it slightly. There we are. Okay. What we're going to talk about today is, firstly, my idea of creativity is everything. The purpose of me sort of saying these things, as I just said, is for some sort of debate to happen, some sort of discussion to be put into place, right? It's not supposed to be myself or Robin as some sort of wonderful people who know everything, because I'm sure neither of us do. Most certainly don't. There's not going to be some sort of magic revelation. There's not going to be like a little wizard going poof and everything's going to be okay, because what we both really talk about a lot is this idea that you can't get someone to do this for you. You have to find the right person to work with from the point of view of you working as a partnership, as a couple, to do this together. That is an area where myself and Robin very, very much agree that approach must be that you're not having someone doing it to you, if you like. You're doing it with somebody. Is that about right, Robin?
Yeah, I think it's finding the approach and that works for you. And if you feel that you want to work with someone, finding the person that's right for you, like you said, that's a good match. They're not doing it for you. They're holding a space for you. They're supporting you. They're shining a light for you to find your own answers. Because everybody else, we all have opinions and we all could advise, but we're advising from our perspective, which is not the same as the person who's looking for the answers. They need to find their own perspective. Sure, they can take and assess and weigh up other people's information, but they need to find their own answers.
And if I can just explain the background in the relation to the way that we've decided to do this. I haven't told Robin exactly what this idea is about, right? And in turn, she'll come up with something and she won't tell me exactly what it's about. And the reason for that is because we can then be the audience with you. We can then hear these things as you hear them. And if necessary, we can query them, we can question them, we can make comments on them. So if there is anything that you want to say, obviously, when you do see this podcast, please do leave us a little bit of a message or whatever it is on this particular thing, but I think it's down there. And then obviously we'll get back to you with some answers or some ideas in relation to what it is that you ask. So let's get on with it. Creativity is everything. This is an area in which I'm working an awful lot at the moment. The creativity comes into it from the perspective that I find that this works for me. I'll tell you a little bit about my story briefly later on, but we'll come back to that as we go along. I find this works really well for me. And the reason being is because we ever heard of the saying, right? The devil makes, what is it, Rob? The devil makes works for idle hands. Yeah, well, I'm thinking the devil makes works for idle minds as well. And because you have this situation where you can actually be productive, you can be creative, and you can produce something that you're proud of. I've got all these notes down here, and I've already gone off them already, right? So I'm still, I'm freestyling already here, right? What happens is the fact that I think a lot of people who go through depressive illness or who are heading towards that sort of area, they have far too much time unoccupied in their minds and in their lives. So they overthink, they actually second guess things, they actually start losing confidence in themselves because of the fact that they get to examine things too closely. And they're not then occupied in relation to positive things, in relation to creative things. And if I put my glasses back on a second, some of the things I wrote down here, this is about taking a holistic view of creativity and its potential benefits. This is not necessarily about poetry or photography or writing. Having said that, you've just written a very good book, apparently. I understand. Maybe we'll plug that a little bit later, shall we?
Well, it's interesting because I was just re-recording a bit I'm doing the audiobook at the moment, and it talks about being too much in our headspace.
Yeah.
And we have the head brain, the heart brain, and the gut brain. And
Yeah.
our society, our conditioning, the way our school system works is very much head brain focused.
Yeah.
And I think my take on what you're saying is that that's spending too much time up here, going into those looping, maybe the inner critic getting in the way, and overthinking, second guessing, all the stuff that you're saying, because we're not bringing in the space for the heart brain and the gut brain. And each of these has different strengths to bring to how we look at things and how we navigate our way through things. So not just the purely logical and having to do a set of steps, but also, what does your heart say? Your joy and your love and your excitement, what do they bring to the equation? Or just be careful of that. That maybe isn't in alignment for you. And the gut the same, because they say listen to your gut, don't they?
Yeah.
Because your gut is sending
I've made a
your
mistake over the years. As I've got older, I've realized in retrospect, my gut feeling has probably been right about 85% of the time.
Yeah.
And I've probably listened to it less than 50% because of outside influences, because of people saying, "Oh, you sure? Oh, you shouldn't be doing that. You shouldn't be doing this." And I think, I don't know what the physiology of it is, but we have an instinct for a reason.
Yeah.
It's there to tell us.
There's more information going from the gut to the brain than from the brain to the gut.
Yeah.
And we have our whole mesenteric system with all of that, the nervous connections, and they're picking up most of the serotonin, our mood hormone, comes from the gut. So it really is a very good, yeah. That's why our diet is so important as well. And there are so many factors in it all. But listening to the gut can really help us to know, is that the way for me, or is that not resonating for me? Because again, it's very individual.
I've just realized, actually, just off the top of my head, just from what you were just saying, this is why I like so much about the conversation, about you not knowing, where this is going as far as I'm concerned to start with. Because what you're talking about there sort of sums up the difference between that mechanical, what did you call it? You called it the head side, didn't you?
The head brain, when we're very much head focused, and when we get anxious, it's very much the left brain, which is the logical, rational, needing processes, needing a set of steps in black and white, versus the right side, which is the creative side, which is what you're talking about.
Well, I'm just thinking now that the creativity part of it sort of, I don't know if it's the right word, but subverts the more mechanical side of your nature, because of the fact that I'm just going to talk about that now in relation to pride, in relation to achievement, in relation to bringing something into the world, giving birth to this particular thing that never existed before. And I did actually write down here, my apologies to 49% of the world's population, all the men out there, when I talk about giving birth, but I am being metaphorical here, You're actually producing something that wasn't there before. And that's a huge cause for celebration as far as I'm concerned. That's how I feel about it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it's also interesting that as I've got older, I've also learned about external gratification, external sort of people saying things, oh, that's great, that's not great, that's bad, this is terrible, that's awful, that's wonderful type thing. And I've become much more internal in relation to the way that I appreciate what I do. I actually make educational and information films about positive well-being. And the creativity is everything as something that's come around literally within the last few weeks, because I realized that the core of what I was doing, the core of what I wanted to talk about, the core of what I was creating is not the end result. It's not this thing about whether people, likes and subscribers and all that sort of thing, even though they're interesting, even though they're important from an ego point of view, I suppose, they're not what this is about. This is about me utilizing my experiences in life, most of which are very positive, some of which have been quite negative, to actually help other people. And that is the purpose. That is the creativity. It's not to do with gratification. It's not to do with people saying, oh, Nigel, you're wonderful, or why are you making this rubbish? You know what I mean? It's really, really important to me that I've sort of drilled down into what this is about. And it's the creative process that actually excites me. It's the creative process that interests me. And a big part of what I do is in relation to trying to encourage other people, knocking down barriers for other people and saying, well, you can do this. If you've got a phone, get your granny to act, get your dog to act, if you've got a little microphone of some sort, then get out there and tell your story. And that's where my interests really lie. And that's why this I should have called it something easier. Creativity is everything actually came about. Anyway, I digress. I'm supposed to be talking about these notes. So holistic, creative, it's not just about poetry, photography, painting, performance, singing, dancing, and all those sort of things. This is more talking about somebody being creative in whatever way sort of floats their boat, in whatever way they can get excited or interested or be proud of what they've actually produced.
And so I think we have quite a restricted view sometimes about what creativity means. So I think that's a really important point, because sometimes people say, I'm not creative, because they have this concept of creativity means, and it might be being a painter, or I make something with my hands like pottery or woodcraft. But I think creativity, because as you know, I used to have another podcast where I invited people on to talk about well-being, and all of them were creative, but in different ways. So you came on to talk about the work that you do, and I had an artist come on to talk about her work, and somebody who made jewelry come on to talk about her work. And people who write, I've got somebody writing for my newsletter for the next edition, and she's going to be talking about writing. We are all creative, but it's finding our own personal way of expression of that.
I think it's a means to an end, mind, because I think it's not, again, it's a word I use a lot, but I actually mean it in this literal sense. It's not the mechanics of, this is going back to what you were saying about the head. Sorry, what was the expression? Head
brain. Just head being brain, too much right? In your headspace,
Yeah, and getting away from that and using something, whatever it is your thing is, to actually remove you from that and take you somewhere else. And for me, that somewhere else isn't the idea of how am I going to make this happen, because anybody who creates anything, they will know that they'll abandon 40% of it, because it's just not, they don't feel it, it's not working, it's not reaching subjective, there's something wrong somewhere along the way, I think once you can learn to accept that and think to yourself, well, that's all part of the process, that's not failure. There's this saying, I try to avoid, I like to be a cliche-free zone as much as possible, right? But there is this one, every failure is an opportunity to learn. And that is so, so true. Because if you didn't fail, you wouldn't be in that place where you had to learn that particular thing.
Absolutely. FAIL, first attempt in learning.
Yeah.
And you were saying about that it's wrong and it's not working. But for me, I don't see things as right or wrong, good or bad. It was a first attempt. It was a step along the way. So you were saying that each part of that process has, there's a reason for it. And you might take a step down a certain way, because until you've done that, you don't know yet, is this going to work for me or is it not? In that respect, for me, it's a very important step. It's not something to say that was a waste of time, or I got it wrong, or it was a failure. No, it was important. It was learning. It was realizing that step didn't work for me. So I can now discount that, rather than maybe going forward and thinking, oh, I wonder if. So it was an important step. I think whatever we do is an important step along that journey of learning more about who we are and what ways we can express ourselves in that moment. Because just because it didn't work then doesn't mean to say you can't circle back and try it another time. Because in another situation, another time, it might be exactly what you want to do.
You just mentioned something again interesting there. Again, it's slightly going off what we were talking about, but that doesn't really matter. We can talk about whatever we like. You just mentioned about this circling back idea, right? I mean, it's something I talk an awful lot about, is the fact that you can never undo anything. You can go back, as you said, going forward, if you like. I mean, you can't physically go back and stop anything happening. And there's this thing I talk about, no fret and no regret, because they're absolutely useless emotions. Very, very difficult as human beings not to do them. I appreciate that, because it's a natural sort of instinct for a certain period of time. But interesting, you said about going back forward, if you're still with me, to review
absolutely.
what you did or what happened, because it may not be something you did. It may be circumstance that dictated that this thing sort of went a certain way. I try to avoid the word failure now, right? I'm not going to say failed anymore.
Learning.
So, learning, yes, we'll go for learning. So you've learned from this particular thing, and what do you feel in relation to, you are where you are at this particular moment? Because a lot of people get stressed and they get tense because they wish things were different. They wish literally this little wizard could come along and go poof, and everything's going to change. What do you think about that? What's your take on that?
There are things that are outside of our control. And that's maybe why we wish for the wizard with the wand who's just going to zap and everything is different. But we can't change them. And I think it's an unhelpful use of our energy to worry about things like that. There are things that are within our control. And if we can focus on those things and shape those things in the way that are right for us, and we do that by choosing which thoughts, beliefs, perceptions support us, that we want to engage with and we want to feed, because they will then grow stronger, versus the ones that aren't helpful. And if we don't pay too much attention, obviously there are things that come up because we are human beings, as you said.
Yeah.
But it's our choice then. Is this helping me? Is it making me feel better? Am I feeling uplifted? If not, right, I'm not going to feed that. I'm going to feed the stuff that does help me. And it's not to say that that's always easy, or that we don't sometimes get caught realizing we've been doing this for half an hour. I promised myself I was never going to do that again. But it's like the ex-smoker.
Robin, half an hour. I'm talking about years ago. I used to do it for days. I'd be cogitating, thinking, and wishing and hoping and all that. Thankfully, I don't do that anymore now.
But it depends how conscious we are and how long we've been going along this path of, that's not what I want to engage with. I'm going to engage with this. Because yes, if we've spent a lot of time engaging with the stuff that doesn't lift us up, it's worn quite a groove in our brains, and neurons that fire together wire together. So they're very strong, and it can easily pull us back in if we're not being conscious. It's like the smoker who decides they're going to give up, and then 2 minutes later, they realize they have a cigarette in their hand, because it becomes part of our muscle memory and we just do it automatically. But the more we realize, oh, I've got a cigarette in my hand, put that out, and then let it go. Not beat ourselves up, because again, we can often, oh, I'm back here doing this thing I promised myself I'd never do, and bringing in all that guilt and shame, which, as you were saying about that other stuff, it just doesn't serve us. So the more we focus on the new habit that we want to create, then the better that is for us.
I think absolutely. I think it's also a practical thing, not only in relation to sort of putting good things, positive things in the place of sort of potential negative things, but we only have in our life, in reality, a certain amount of time. We only have a certain bandwidth mentally in relation to what we do and what we pay attention to. And I think it's just a fact that if you spend so much time doing that, you haven't got enough room, you haven't got enough time, you haven't got enough energy for the other stuff. So from a practical point of view, it's a matter of saying, well, I need to make room for this other stuff, which is going to be good for me. I need to get rid of the stuff that's causing me actual or potential stress and tension. And I think, again, that's something I learned after I went through my episode of depressive illness. And I came out the other side in the golden, what they call the gold cloud line. I'm not very good at these sayings, am I?
The silver lining within the cloud.
That's the one. It's got nothing to do with the gold lining whatsoever. Yeah. The silver lining was the fact that my perception had changed much more positively. I was hearing the birds sing, and I was feeling the wind on my face, and I was seeing the colors of the trees and the sky and stuff like that. I became much more receptive. And the thing is that you can't, if you are in a position where you're filling your life full of all the negativity, if all the stuff which you can't sort of find any use for, or more to the point, funnily enough, and it's going a little bit deeper now, but the stuff that you unconsciously don't know that there's no use for, if you know what I mean. You don't know it's damaging you. You don't know that it's causing you problems. It's just sort of bubbling away in the background there, just doing its damage sort of thing, So I think from a practical point of view, we have to make time for it. We have to make the effort to make time for it. Yeah.
And I think getting back to the creativity, that really helps us to do these kinds of exploration and expression of things. The more that we do it, I think the deeper it takes us. It's like any practice. The more we do that expression, the more we play with that creativity, the more we learn from it and the more we learn about ourselves.
I was going to actually say, I should have said this a little bit earlier on, actually, before I went off on a tandem, as they say. These three words were chosen very carefully. This creativity is everything was chosen very carefully because it's three simple words, but it's got two very distinct meanings. The objective is the same. It's like what we're talking about, our purpose in doing this podcast, right? These two different directions, but to get to the same place, the same objective. If you think about it, creativity is everything can mean exactly what we've just been talking about. It can be whatever you want it to be. It doesn't have to be only that or only that or only that. It can be whatever gladdens your heart. It can be whatever makes you relax. It can be whatever makes you proud, whatever gives you fulfillment. Just that nice little spark in your life, that positive thing, that positive energy going on. But the other way of looking at it is, if you think creativity is everything, it also means that it's a huge, in itself, just this lump of creativity, whatever you want to call it, however you want to describe it, is such an important thing. Because if you think about it, if you make this happen, I got to put my hands down. I must wave my hands around all the time. If you sort of think about it, this thing is connected to so many other things. Just the fact that we see something, the fact that we take on board its meaning, we take on board what it's trying to say to us, we take on board something visually, and we find that, I have to keep doing this anyway, we take on board how exciting it is visually to see that thing, or a piece of music, and you go, oh, what a fantastic piece of music, Yeah. And that's all connected to creativity, but that's all connected to our human experience. It's all connected to how we view the world, either in a positive or a negative way. So I just want to throw that in. That's why we chose those 3 words with those 2 separate meanings. But the bottom line is the fact that we're talking about how can creativity, how can whatever you want to make it, how can that have a positive influence on your well-being? That's the gold standard. That's the thing that we're actually looking for.
And for me, what you were just saying about the music and the creativity, it brings life, doesn't it? It is
Yeah,
life.
yeah,
Without that, life is bland, it's boring, it's two-dimensional, it's colorless. When you bring creativity in and you bring art in its broadest sense, and I'm reminded as well of a quote, I think it was Sri Abhinashdo, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but the quote was about spirituality, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions about spirituality, about the importance of it in our lives, but also about what it means. A lot of people maybe think of it in terms of religion, and I don't mean it that way at all. It can be for people that works for, but also just, I think it's a he, Sri Avinashdo was saying that spirituality is actually just the thing that makes you feel more beautiful inside of
yeah,
you.
yeah,
So it brings that light, it brings that color, it brings that joy, it brings that meaning to your life, because without that, life is just so bland, and why would you want to be here? It's just every day is monotonous,
yeah.
monotone and monochrome, versus bring in the music, bring in the color, bring in the joy. Like you were saying about feeling the wind, the breeze on your face, and seeing the colors, seeing the wind in the trees, listening to the bird song, all of that stuff. And for me, yes, that is everything. That is what life is all about.
But you were very big about the countryside. I know you live in the
Yeah.
countryside because I've actually
Yeah.
visited you there, right? And
Yeah.
you've got horses and dogs and a menagerie of different animals, right? So obviously to you tune in really well to this idea of nature, this idea of you talk about what you're doing. It's actually called WILD, wild, as in wildlife, as in the wild world sort of thing. And we'll talk more either in this podcast or in another podcast in relation to your thinking behind that. But this is an area which you're obviously extremely well tuned into because of that passion, that liking or that need for that stuff.
And that's very true. But then my husband is an engineer, and his idea of that beauty and that art and that creativity is looking at an engine or a well-designed, well-crafted tool. And I remember he used to work for a compressor company, and we used to go back and visit them every so often. And they had this massive, great thing hanging from the ceiling. I don't even know what it was. I'm not good up on tools and engine parts.
A
But it was,
massive big thing hanging from the ceiling.
yeah, it was a part of an
That's your
engine.
that's your interpretation of this particular item. I love it.
Sorry, my
That's
husband's
great,
not here
Karen.
to ask me, what was that? What do you call that thing? But it was beautiful. The way that it was engineered, it was like a piece of art. You could go to a gallery and see something that was the way it was shaped, and there was so much symmetry in it and so much beauty in the polish of the metal and the way that it reflected the light. And, I would walk in and think, that's a thing of beauty. I haven't a clue what it is, but it's a
Doesn't
thing of
matter.
beauty. No, it
Doesn't
doesn't.
matter.
I mean, if you were an engineer, it would, I'm sure. But just as a thing of beauty that somebody had created. So I don't think that we should say creativity has to be this or beauty has to be a certain thing. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah.
So whether it's engineering or it's nature or whatever it is, I think it's having that space that creativity really is everything. But for you as an individual, whoever you might be, you have permission for your creativity to be whatever, but also that it can change over time. It doesn't have to be limited to this is your creativity and that's it. That's all you've got for your whole lifetime. You can bring in and play with. Play is a big thing for me. Play with and experiment and explore anything and everything, whatever floats your boat or draws you.
It was interesting you mentioned about Tim and him being an engineer now, right? Because this idea, or part of this idea that I talked about earlier on about it, I read out a little list and I said about it doesn't have to be photography, painting, performance, singing, dancing, poetry, etc., etc. It could be so much more, or it can be those things. There's nothing wrong with those things. We're not relegating those things. But a session I did some time ago, the bit on the end was, by coincidence, I said, it can be sewing, it can be crochet,
it can be car mechanics.
So I actually brought that up previously. I mean, I didn't put it down today until you actually mentioned about his passion for these particular things. But it only goes to show that that passion can be in all sorts of shapes and sizes. What is the nature of the beast? How big is it? What's it smell like? What does it look like? Doesn't really matter. It's what you see it as. Do you see what I mean?
And if it was only nature for everybody on the planet, or only engineering for everybody on the planet, how boring would that be?
We're back to that boring planet again, Robin. Yeah.
Yeah. So to bring in that color and that variety and that richness, it's necessary for everybody to be unique and to give themselves permission to express that.
I actually summed this up. Sorry, go on. Sorry.
No, I was just saying, I think that's so important that we give ourselves permission to follow our own light and to create our own expression.
I actually wrote down, there was one sentence here, the happiness and contentment of giving something out. And this is really important to me from the point of view of you tend to only, maybe with your loved ones, you give something out. Maybe with your friends, you give something out. But by doing this, you're actually giving something out to the world. You're actually giving something out of yourself. Now, there's certain downsides to that. Obviously, there can be, but that goes back to what we were saying about the naysayers and, oh, it's not very good, and all this sort of thing earlier on, right? But once you've dealt with that in your mind and you realize it's not about external validation, it's about internal validation, then that to me is a contentment of giving something out. That's something which I didn't have when I was a police officer, even though everybody else externally is saying, oh, you do a wonderful job and you do a great thing for the community and for people, you keep us safe and all that. And I don't denigrate any of that at all, because that's what, to a great extent, the vast majority of police officers do. That's their vocation. That's what they want to do. And the reason I do the work that I do now is because I feel it's the extension of that. And I wrote down, it's about enjoying, about having a sense of pride and fulfillment. If you like, a bit of justifiable arrogance. That's an expression I really like, because not only the British, but us as British, we're very much sort of, we don't talk about ourselves. Oh no, we that's not the thing we do, sort of thing. It's impolite. It's big-headed. It's arrogant, And I think that you can then get to a point in your mind where you know that there's two types of arrogance. There's the arrogance which is basically delusion. And it's the delusion of saying, I am fantastic at everything. Look at me, I'm Nigel Streeter. I know that. No, nobody knows it all, including me. Unfortunately, Robin, I got to say, also including you.
Nigel.
I know. It's a harsh thing to say, but there we are. But no, seriously, there's nobody that knows it all. But there is also another type of arrogance, which is like this justifiable arrogance that I talk about, which is the fact that you've measured this in your mind and you thought, well, yeah, I have the right to say I'm good at that. I have the right to say I produced that. I made that. I made this thing happen. And I think that's to me is a big part of it. And then I wrote, funny enough, I'm going back through this stuff here now, and as we're sort of riffing along, and I'm trying to keep to my script as best as possible, it says, talk about self-care, development, and appreciation. Well, self-care is what I was just saying about having a genuine appreciation of what you've got, what your attributes are, what contribution you can make for your own benefit, because there's an altruistic side and there's also a selfish side in relation to how can you make yourself feel good by achieving certain things, by knowing that you have these things, and also how can you use those things to benefit other people, to make other people's, just by giving them little bits of information. We've talked so many times about, we both love this idea of simple, not complicating things, because complication comes through, in my opinion, either through arrogance, unjustifiable arrogance, or it comes through insecurity. So when you've got that security of mind,
both are to do with insecurity, I think.
yeah, maybe.
And Brené Brown talks about we puff up, we armor up, or we shrink back. And that puffing up is, to me, I think what you're describing in the unjustifiable arrogance. And people who do that, quite often inside, they're feeling rather insecure, which is why they puff up like a puffer fish, so that appear big and therefore not going to be threatened by something else because I'm bigger than you.
Yeah.
But it comes from an insecurity inside.
It does. I mean, it's sort of, this complication thing is put forward by people who don't have the confidence to look for. I'm not saying simple always works, because it doesn't. Sometimes simple isn't available. Look, those people are not prepared to look for it either. One, because they want to do, I love the analogy, the puffer fish. I think that's really nice. They want to make themselves bigger. They want to make themselves more important. They want to make themselves more foreboding, if you like, in some sort of way. That's where they get this sense of power from. Or alternatively, they can't believe the simple can work, because no, it can't be that straightforward. You go from A, just to B, just like that. Yeah, you know,
way too simple.
Yeah, I think so. And I think people get sort of, they forget that about themselves when they turn around and they'll say to themselves about, oh, I can't be that good. I can't be that capable of doing something, you know. And that's that self-care and self-concern, really. And overall, it's about a feeling of achievement on your terms, I wrote down, which is a nice expression. Because we've talked a lot, or at least I've talked a lot today, about this idea about not doing it on other people's terms. You can't live in isolation. Well, some people can, hermits can, but they're very, very rare. But most people can't live in isolation because we're social creatures, because we like to have contact. And I think that if you do it on your terms, it has so much more power. And this is not a no-sum game. I'm not talking about a situation where you start there, and then if you get this idea of being able to be creative, to be able to communicate and to connect with people on a positive level, in a positive way, if you develop those skills, abilities, whatever you want to call them, you don't just go back from down there, from being worried, from being tense, from being nervous, from being stressed, to there. You go all, wrong hand now, see, that's backwards on the camera, all the way up to there. It takes you right to the top, because you've not only got rid of a problem, but you've created something which is so, so positive. So it's not a no-sum game, really.
Yeah.
So I actually wrote down, why is this important? A large part of some people's well-being can be quite closely attached to those feelings of usefulness and achievement. We've already talked about that earlier on. You know, the sense of well-being. I actually achieved something. I am useful in some way.
And we all need to feel that we have a purpose. And I've had this conversation quite a few times over the last couple of days, working with various people and meeting a friend for coffee this morning about purpose. But for me, our purpose is actually just to be more ourselves and to find ways to express that, which is coming back to creativity. And I loved what you were saying earlier about that kind of interconnection and interdependence, because I think that's why creativity kind of is everything. It underpins everything. It supports everything. It connects everything. It's maybe a golden thread that joins all of these things up. So yeah, it really is so valuable for our well-being in so many ways.
It's really, I think it's a means. Let me get this right now. This is not actually what I've got written down here. I'm just actually thinking as I go along now. It can mean being actively and sort of positively and usefully occupied, both mentally and physically. Do you know what I mean? You made a good point earlier on in relation to this idea about filling your time up with negatives, I extrapolated from what you said, filling up your time with negatives or filling up your times with positives, sort of thing. And this is about being usefully occupied in both those ways. I mentioned earlier on, I've written it down here, the devil makes work for idle hands and minds, right? We talked about that earlier on.
Yeah. And I think we are multi-layered beings. We are at least mind, body, spirit. And I think and that's very much what I look at when I'm doing my work, that we bring in all of those layers. So I think you were talking about mentally, physically. I think also spiritually, in whatever way that manifests for the individual. Socially, all of it, creativity is in there in all of that. And all of that is supported by our creativity.
It's a friend of mine called Fritz, very good friend of mine. And he's, I think I may have told you the story before, but obviously people watching this won't have heard this before. Good friend of mine, and he's actually diagnosed as a schizophrenic. He's very, very stable. He's not violent in any way. He doesn't fit any of the stereotypes and the sort of the ways that people talk about schizophrenia, because they very often associate, or they mistake things like schizophrenia for psychosis and stuff like that. And they're very different things. And he is a lovely, lovely fella. And he uses what we call creative therapy in relation to his mental well-being. He's not taking any antipsychotic drugs anymore. And I've got to give you a genuine, serious health warning here now. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a healer in any way. And I'm most certainly not saying that you should use these things instead of medical advice or medication. But I'm just saying about whether you could think about this as an add-on. So not instead of, most certainly not instead of. And in Fritz's case, he hasn't taken antipsychotic medication for years because he makes literally loads and loads and loads of different types of films. And he finds that occupies his thoughts and his mind so much. And we actually made a film called This Is Who I Am. Talks about these voices, which he still gets occasionally, but they're not malevolent voices. They're not nasty voices, not telling him to do bad things. They just sort of, he describes it as being like his friends that talk to him on occasions, almost like they physically are there, which is a little bit of a hard concept for maybe the likes of me and you to understand. But to him, this is quite normal. He uses these things, and he says in the film, they whisper lyrics to him for his songs, and he writes songs, and he actually makes music. They give him plot lines in relation to some of the films that he makes on his own, or we make together as Fritz Street's films. And if you look at how this has had such a positive effect on him, and the health warning is, this is not for everybody. This is just something for somebody to add on as something to try. Because I know it works for me, it works for him, and it works for other people that we know. And he was heavily medicated going back 2 decades ago now, I suppose, thereabouts. But he was heavily medicated, and he doesn't take any medication in relation to his mental ill health at all now. Or I won't even call it ill health, his mental condition. Because to all intents and purposes, that's his reality. He's not ill. That's his reality. That's the world he lives in. And he's quite happy living in that world. I'm just thinking, if this could work a quarter as good for somebody else, alongside whatever else they need to do in their lives, then this has got to be a good thing. This is something worth having a crack at. This is something worth giving a go. That's my only picture today is in relation to that.
Yeah, it's worth that exploration. It's worth exploring and playing with in a safe environment. And I think for Fritz as well, a lot of it maybe is to do with he's giving expression. He's working with what's going on within him, as opposed to feeling that it's something wrong and something to be pushed aside and pushed down, because that's, like you were saying about that stuff that's there in the background festering away, causing problems, versus Fritz is just, this is who I am. And
this is who I am. What a cracking name for a film. This is who I am.
Indeed. And he's found a way to express it and work with it in healthy ways.
He sees it as his release. He sees it as his safety valve.
Yeah, that's what I mean by expression. Expression in both terms of the words, as in I'm expressing myself, but also I'm expressing the stuff that I need to get out of myself. I'm expressing it.
It's interesting because he'll check with me, check by me, whichever expression, on a number of occasions about certain things which I'll say to him from my and I definitely do this with inverted commas, my normal perspective, whatever normal is. We've all got a different normal. But from my usual or majority perspective, he'll check with me. He said, well, I've been thinking about so-and-so, so-and-so. Is that bad? And I say, well, the idea is a little bit sort of unacceptable to the masses, I suppose, really. But he's got no intention of doing these things. He's got no intention of carrying these things out. But it's almost like it gives him the ability to check with me, where the parameters are in relation to what you make, what you show. And I think he really likes that because of the fact that to him, in his world, they seem reasonably I'm not talking about terrible things. I'm just talking about things which are sort of slightly unspoken these days about certain subjects and all that sort of thing. You know what I mean?
But even things like bringing death into a conversation. I've got a friend who runs a death cafe because people don't talk about death.
Yeah.
And yet some people really need to ask questions and to have a place where it's okay. So she runs a death cafe. But you look at some of the stuff we've got on television, particularly nowadays. When I was growing up, you didn't have the level of the violence that they show on television these days, or various other bits and pieces. And I was in the Barbara Woodhouse. No, it wasn't Barbara Woodhouse. That was the dog woman. Who was the other woman who was saying, you can't have this before the 9 o'clock watershed and all of that kind of
Mrs.
stuff.
Whitehouse.
That was the one. I knew there was a house in there somewhere.
Yeah.
Things are shifting and changing, and nowadays there's a lot more violence out there. There's violence in video games, there's violence in movies, there's violence in books. I choose not to go there because that's not my thing, but that's in people's minds. So how can we make that distinction and say that's okay, but then something else isn't? Fritz is having thoughts, and I'm not saying he's having violent thoughts, but he's having thoughts that is not in the neurotypical way of looking at things. Yet somebody is saying that's not acceptable. It goes under, there's a booklet that is for diagnosing mental health conditions, and they just keep adding new things. And they do it randomly. Because I was in a meeting where they were discussing this, and it's also on YouTube. Somebody's done a TED talk about this. Basically, people have just decided in a committee that's a mental health condition. Whereas if you go to other countries where they're much more collective rather than individualistic societies, and if you look back into our history, they would have just been the person in the village who was a little bit different, maybe a little bit odd.
Yeah.
But they were part of the village. And now we just, no, you go off and you live in a different area, and we're not maybe so much into institutionalizing people anymore, but you go off and you get your medication, or just don't come into my world. Whereas they're just another human being. They're a bit different. But then again, we need people who see the world differently because it can be a great creative way. I mean, you look at people like Van Gogh, who nowadays probably would have been shunted off to take some meds. He cut off his own ear. People, there's that also, they say there's a very fine line between
madness and genius.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Handel wrote the Messiah in 14 days.
Yeah.
Creative genius. Sometimes people say it's very, very close to madness, but it's a form of expression. And when we can work with it, it serves us so much better than when we work against it.
It's really interesting because we work well together because of the fact that we actually like each other very much. So we get on very well, which is the first thing, And it goes back to what we said right in the beginning about this joy, about this fulfillment, about this, the fact it's fun, right? If it's not fun, then sometimes in life, for money purposes or personal purposes or promotion purposes, you have to do things which aren't fun. But when you can, if you've got that opportunity, first of all, you're very fortunate. And secondly, you should grab it with both hands. Both hands. And then you get a situation where he is the one who tends to be less organized than me. I'm the boring one. I'm the one that says, oh, we need to be here and we need to be gone by then and we need to be doing this and we need to speak to so-and-so and whatever. Because of my previous police background, not easy to say, and because of my nature, that's the way that I function. but he's the one with a lot of the sort of like the craziness, a lot of the sort of the creativity. But if you put those two things together, if you had two people like him or two people like me, you wouldn't get anything done. Nothing would ever get sort of sorted.
You'd
But
certainly never come up with the amazing films that you guys make together.
oh well, some of them are amazing. That's me done. That's all I've got to say about my particular subject. And thank you very much for your observations and your questions. The next time round, we're going to be putting you on the spot.
Excellent.
Do you want to say what you're going to be talking about, or do you want to leave that to the
We'll
future?
give a little teaser. Yeah, next time we're going to be talking about how life gets messy, but it's a good thing.
I'm so intrigued by this, but before we started doing this recording, I was talking to Robin and I was saying about, I got the impression that she's one of the least messy people I've ever met, right? We've actually met in real life. It's not just in the ether. And she said, well, let her tell you herself. So I say to her, right, we'll set this up now. So anyway, when you put something online about sort of the messy stuff, and I thought that you were one of the least messy people in the world. And you said,
that's how you see it, looking in. Looking out, it's not always quite the same. Yeah, more about that the next time we meet.
Yeah, thank you very much for your attendance on this one. If there is anything that you want to say, as I said, wherever it is on this machine, up or down, if you want to leave any comments, if there's anything you want to say, please do so. Because the whole purpose of us being here isn't to talk at you and tell you, we think this, we know all the answers, because we most certainly don't. So make any comments, ask any questions, because in the little intro thing, Robin was saying about the importance of asking questions, because lots of people hang on to stuff. There's things that they're thinking of and they think, oh, I won't ask that because it might sound a little bit silly or it might sound a bit irrelevant. Nothing is silly. Nothing is irrelevant. And if you have something that you want to say, some observation or whatever, please do. There or there, wherever.
And also in that vein, that sometimes we have questions that we want to ask, but we might not want to do it in public forum. And obviously, I will be uploading this to my YouTube channel, so that will be public. If you wanted to ask us any questions that you want to do that effectively anonymously, we will know, obviously, if you're emailing us. Feel free to get in touch with us individually. And maybe it's something that Nigel has said that you want to respond to or ask about, or something that I've said. So, you can go with whoever one of us you want to talk to. Don't feel that you have to sit on that question because you don't want to ask it publicly. Feel free to get in touch with us privately as well.
And just to finish, we've actually got the email addresses and our separate details will be coming up on the screen almost by magic. Just after we I almost got to the end then, Robin. That wasn't bad, was it? Yeah. Just after we've finished talking now, you will see our email addresses on the screen. Please do get in touch if you want to.
We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you very much for your time and your attention. It's been great.
See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.